7 brides had fled the Alpha King of Ashenreach. Not one had made it to the final vow. Not one had spoken the binding words. Some had turned pale the moment the great bronze doors of the Hall of Ashes closed behind them. Some had fainted at the first sight of the throne. Some had waited until the king himself drew aside the iron veil from his face, and then they had gathered their skirts and run into the night, trailing silk and ruin behind them. Tonight, the 8th bride was already beginning to tremble. Selene watched from the shadow of a cold stone pillar at the far end of the hall, her hands knotted into the rough linen of her apron, her heart so loud she was certain the nearest guard could hear it through his helm. She had come to this place because her mistress had commanded her to come. She had come because servants did not refuse. She had come because, as her mother had whispered to her since she was a child, and Omega kept her head bowed and her voice softer and her eyes, above all, away from the face of any Alpha who had not given her leave to look. And so, Selene looked at the floor. At first, the Hall of Ashes was vast and cold, carved from black stone that swallowed the light of 1,000 candles. Iron chandeliers hung from beams thicker than a grown man's waist. The banners of the royal house, a white stag crowned in flame, stirred faintly in a draught that smelled of wax and old smoke and the iron bitterness of the mountain wind. 200 nobles had been summoned to witness the rite of binding. None of them looked hopeful. Most of them looked as if they had come to watch an execution. And perhaps they had. Everyone in Ashenreach knew what the 8th failure would mean. The council had already begun to whisper of transferring the crown, of declaring the royal bloodline broken, of ending the line of kings who had held the northern throne for 6 generations, because no woman of the realm could bear to stand before the last of them long enough to say the binding words. Lady Marivelle of House Orlain was the council's final gamble. She walked the long aisle of dark marble now, in a gown of white silk trimmed with silver thread, her veil so fine that her face was visible beneath it. A very beautiful face, a face that had been promised to the throne since she was 9 years old, when her father had signed the betrothal terms in exchange for the lifting of a tax that would otherwise have beggared his house. She was 23 now. She had spent every day of the last 14 years preparing for this single walk down this single aisle. She looked, Selene thought, as if she were walking toward her own grave. The king sat upon the throne, and even from this distance Selene could see that he did not move, did not breathe, did not, as far as she could tell, exist in the way that other men existed. His great cloak was black as pitch. His crown was a thin circle of iron. His face was hidden beneath a heavy veil of beaten silver that fell from his brow all the way to his collarbone, leaving only the rigid set of his shoulders and the dark glint of his ungloved hands to mark him as a living thing. 7 brides had fled him. Lady Marivelle mounted the first step of the dais. She paused. The second step. She paused longer. By the third, her breath had grown visible in the cold, and her hands, clasped before her waist, were trembling so violently that the silver rings on her fingers clinked softly against one another. Selene heard it from 40 paces away. The hall was that silent. The High Warden of the Rite, an old wolf named Violus with silver threaded through his dark beard, stepped forward from behind the throne. "Lady Marivelle of House Orlain," he intoned, his voice carrying across the cold stone. "You have come freely to stand before Carrion, son of Raithor, Alpha King of Ashenreach, bearer of the flame and the stag. Do you consent to the unveiling?" Lady Marivelle's mouth opened. No sound came out. "My lady." Valus, gentler now. "The rite cannot proceed without your word." A single tear slid down Lady Marivelle's cheek and darkened the silk at her throat. "I consent," she whispered. The king rose. He did not rise the way an ordinary man rises. There was a slowness to it, a deliberate heaviness, as if every motion of his body had to be weighed and measured before it was permitted. He stepped forward. He lifted both of his hands, and Selene saw that those hands were marked, not with the fine scars of a duelist, but with long, pale ridges that ran from wrist to knuckle in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost like a writing no one living could still read. He took hold of the silver veil. He drew it aside. Selene had sworn, before she crossed the threshold of this hall, that she would not look. She had sworn it to her mother's memory. She had sworn it to the small wooden charm she kept hidden beneath her apron. She had sworn it to herself 3 separate times on the walk through the corridor. She looked anyway. She did not mean to. Her eyes lifted without her permission, the way a needle lifts toward a lodestone, and she saw him. She saw him completely, and everything inside her went still. Lady Marivelle screamed. The scream was the loudest thing that had ever been in that hall. It bounced from the black stone walls and came back threefold, a sound that was all terror and no language, and before it had even stopped echoing, Lady Marivelle was moving. Backward. Down the dais steps. Stumbling. Her veil caught on the iron brazier at the foot of the throne and tore with a sound like a slap. She did not stop for it. She caught up the skirt of her gown in both hands, and she ran. Down the aisle, past the silent nobles, past the advisors who did not even try to stop her, past the great bronze doors, which the guards had already begun to open, because they had been expecting this. They had all been expecting this. Lady Marivelle of House Orlane vanished into the corridor, and the sound of her running feet grew smaller and gone. The Hall of Ashes was silent. The king still stood. The veil hung from his lowered hand. His face was bare to the candlelight, and Selene, who had never in her life disobeyed a single rule, found that she could not look away from it. Vilas closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he straightened. "The rite is broken," he said. "The 8th bride has fled. The council shall convene at first light to— Wait." The word came from Selene's own mouth. She had not known she intended to speak until it was already said. She heard her own voice as if from very far away, as if some other woman had borrowed her tongue, and for a single suspended breath, she wondered if perhaps some other woman had. 200 heads turned, 200 pairs of eyes fixed upon a small figure in a servant's apron at the back of the hall. Vilas, astonished, managed one word. "Girl?" Selene felt her knees try to buckle. She did not let them. She stepped forward, out of the shadow of the pillar, into the dim pool of candlelight that fell across the dark marble. "The old law," she said. Her voice was not loud, but the hall was so silent that it carried. "When a bride flees the rite, any woman of the realm may step into her place. The law is still written. I have heard it read at every feast day of my life." A ripple of disbelieving laughter crossed the nobles. Someone hissed the word Omega the way a person hisses an insult. Selene did not look at them. She was looking at the king, and the king, at last, was looking at her. "I offer myself," Selene said, and her voice did not shake, which astonished her more than anything else that had happened on this terrible night. "In her place, before the witnesses, before the warden, before you, my lord." The silver veil slipped from the king's hand. It struck the stone of the dais with a small, bright, final sound. Carrion, Alpha King of Ashenreach, took one slow step down from his throne toward her. His eyes found hers and held them, and Selene felt something in the center of her chest catch fire, a heat that had no name, a pull so deep it made her breath stop. "Do you know," he said quietly, "what you have done, little Omega?" Selene could not answer. She did not know. She only knew that she had seen his face, and she had not wanted to run. They took her away first. 2 silent handmaidens, not Lady Marivelle's own, for those had fled with their mistress, escorted Selene from the Hall of Ashes through a corridor of black stone that grew colder with every step, and into a small chamber whose walls were hung with faded tapestries of hunts and battles she did not recognize. They did not speak to her. They bathed her in water that smelled of crushed pine and mountain herbs. They dressed her in a gown of plain gray silk, simpler than Lady Marivelle's had been, almost the gown of a novice. They did not once meet her eyes. When they left her alone. The door closed with the soft click of an iron bolt sliding home from the outside, and Solène understood, with a calmness that frightened her more than fear would have, that she was now a prisoner of her own offer. She sat upon the edge of the narrow bed and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Hours passed. The candles burned lower. The mountain wind worked its slow way through the seams of the shuttered window and stirred the tapestries on the wall. Solène heard, very far away, the sound of a great hall emptying. Carriages in the courtyard, the bark of a captain ordering his guards back to their posts, iron-shod hooves on frozen stone. One by one, the witnesses of her foolishness were departing. By the time the last of them had gone, the castle had fallen into a silence so deep that she could hear her own heartbeat. And then, somewhere in the stone beneath her feet, a single door opened. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy with the weight of a man who did not wish to reach the place he was walking toward. Solène rose. The bolt on her door slid back. The door opened. The King of Ashenreach stood in the threshold in his black cloak, without his crown, without his silver veil. The candlelight fell full across his face. He did not cross the threshold. He stopped there, one hand braced on the doorframe, as if the doorframe were the only thing holding him upright. "You may go," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, rougher, as if he had been using it too much, or not at all. "My lord? The corridor is empty. The guards have been dismissed. The north gate stands unbarred. A horse has been saddled for you. No one will follow. No one will pursue. The law does not compel you to remain once the right has been broken a second time, and I am telling you now, before any witness can be called, that the right is broken." He lifted his scarred hand in a gesture that might have been permission, or might have been a plea. "Go," he said, "before you cannot." Solène looked at him. She did not move. Far above them, in a high gallery that overlooked the corridor outside her chamber, a pair of pale eyes watched from behind a carved screen, unblinking, and the mouth beneath them curved slowly into a thin, patient smile. 7 days passed. She was not queen. She was not bride. She was not, by any name the castle knew, anything at all. But she had a room with a shuttered window and a narrow bed, and she had a tray of bread and honey and pale winter apples left outside her door each dawn, and she had the run of a single wing of the fortress, for the doors at either end were guarded and she did not try them. She would learn later that the king had given orders for the eastern wing to be kept sealed against intruders. The guards at the doors were not there to keep her in. They were there to keep others out. Solène walked the stone corridor of her wing twice each day. She read, from a small library she had discovered behind a curtain at the gallery's end, a book of old border songs whose margins had been filled long ago in a slanting, careful hand. She bathed in the evening. She slept when she could, which was not often. The king did not come, but someone did. On the third morning, there had been a sprig of winter rosemary on her pillow when she returned from her walk, and no servant would claim to have left it. On the fifth morning, a folded square of dark wool, stitched at the edges by hands that were not skilled, placed across the foot of her bed against the cold. On the seventh, when the pale mountain dawn crept through the shutter slats, Solène turned onto her side and found a single object set upon the small table beside her bed. A small wooden charm, carved in the shape of a stag. It was the twin of the one she had worn, hidden beneath her apron, since she was a child. On the 9th night, the dreams began. Solène had been a sound sleeper all her life. As a girl in her mother's small house at the edge of the weavers' district, she had slept through storms, through the rattle of iron carts in the lane outside, through the long winter coughs that eventually took her mother from her. She had been teased for it. Her mother, laughing, had called her the bear cub of the household because she could sleep through anything short of fire. She did not sleep through this. She stood upon a stretch of black stone that she did not recognize and yet knew. It was broken in places, as if something enormous had struck it from above. A cold wind moved across it, carrying the scent of pine and old smoke and iron. She was barefoot. She wore the gray silk gown. She knew, the way one knows things in dreams, that she had been waiting here a very long time. A figure stood at the far end of the black stone. He was too distant for her to see his face, but she knew the shape of him. The wide shoulders, the bowed head, the scarred hands that hung open at his sides, as if he had forgotten how to close them into fists. "My lord," Selene said, and her voice carried across the dark in a way that her waking voice never could. The figure lifted his head. He did not speak, not in words, but she felt something pass between them in the space of a single breath, a warmth, a weight, a recognition so complete that it frightened her, because she had not known that a person could be recognized before they had ever been met. She took one step toward him and woke. The shutters had blown open. The mountain wind was in the chamber. The single candle on her bedside table had guttered to a small blue flame that looked as if it were about to drown. Selene sat upright in the narrow bed with her hand pressed against the hollow at the base of her throat, because something there was burning. Not the skin, something beneath the skin. She stumbled from the bed and crossed to the small clouded mirror that hung beside the washstand, and she held the candle close, and she looked. There was nothing to see. Nothing on the surface of her throat. No mark, no bruise, no rise of heat beneath the skin that she could make out by candlelight. And yet she could feel it still, the way one feels a splinter in a place one cannot quite reach, a dull and persistent heat that had no business being inside her body at all. She pressed her fingers against the place. The heat answered her. It pulsed once, slowly, like a second heartbeat, and then a second time, fainter. And then it settled into a low, steady burn that she understood, in a way she could not explain, was not her own. It was his. Selene sank down onto the cold flagstones of the chamber floor and drew her knees up against her chest and pressed her forehead against them, and she did not weep, because there was no one in the world she could have explained her weeping to. She only sat, with the wind moving around her and the candle flame bending low, and she tried to understand what was happening to her. She had not been marked. She was certain of that. Whatever the Alpha King had done or not done in the last 9 days, he had not come to her chamber, and he had not touched her, and he had laid no claim upon her flesh. And yet, some thread of him had found its way beneath her skin in the dark, and she could feel him now the way one feels the sun through a closed shutter. It was not supposed to be possible. An Omega could not be bound without a bite. Her mother had told her this 100 times. Her mother had told her this the way a mother tells a daughter the things that might one day save her. Unless the old texts had been wrong, unless there was another kind of bond, a kind that had been written about in margins and then struck through, a kind that the Hall of Ashes, with its broken black stone, had seen before and had chosen to forget. Selene lifted her head. Somewhere above her, in the high gallery she had never been permitted to enter, a floorboard creaked. She held her breath. The creak did not repeat. But a moment later, very faint, she heard the soft click of a door being closed with exquisite care, as if the hand that closed it were accustomed to being unheard. She was not alone in this wing of the fortress after all. She had never been alone. On the morning of the 15th day, a man came to clean the corridor outside her chamber. He was stooped and gray and walked with a slight drag in his left leg. He carried a bucket of gray water and a brush with stiff bristles, and he was, from the careful way he did not look at her, the first person in more than a fortnight who had come close enough to speak to her. Selene did not look at him either. She had learned, in her girlhood, the art of being near a servant without appearing to notice a servant, and she used that art now in reverse, sweeping the flagstones of her own threshold with a small hand broom she had been given for her chamber, and speaking, without turning her head, in the low voice that carries only to one ear. "Is there news?" she said. The old man dipped his brush into the gray water. News of what, mistress? The capital, the council, anything. There was a long pause. The brush moved in slow circles on the stone. There is news, he said at last. A great deal of news. They are saying, in the lower city, that the council met 3 days after the broken right. They are saying that they were within one vote of declaring the royal line ended. Solena's broom stopped. What held the vote? The warden, Valus. He stood before them and said that the right had not, in truth, been broken, that a bride had stepped forward in the fled one's place, that the old law had been named and the old law had been honored, and that while that bride remained within the walls of the Hall of Ashes, the succession stood. Solène felt the cold flagstone beneath her knees even through her gown. That is why I am still here. That is why you are still here. And if I leave? The old man did not answer for a moment. He dipped his brush. He wrung it against the rim of the bucket. He set it down, and with a small cloth from his belt he dried his hands before he answered. If you leave, mistress, the line of the Ashen Kings ends before the first snow of the next winter. There are 3 houses who have already drawn up their claim to the throne. 2 of them have been drawing up that claim, I am told, for longer than any of us suspected. There is a rider who was caught at the south gate 4 nights ago with a sealed letter in his boot. The letter was not signed, but the wax that sealed it was not the wax of any of the great houses. Whose wax was it? I do not know, mistress, but the captain who took the letter to the warden did not leave the warden's chamber that night. And when I passed his door in the morning, there were 3 guards at it, and none of them were guards I knew. Solène felt the hollow at the base of her throat pulse once, softly, as if something within her had heard the old man's words and understood them before she did. Is the king in danger? The old man picked up his bucket. The king has been in danger, mistress, since before you were born. You are the first thing that has happened in a long while that might move the danger nearer, or might move it further away. No one yet knows which. He turned to go. Solène spoke again, quickly, before her courage could leave her. The charm, she said. On my pillow. The stag. The old man paused. He did not turn back. I did not leave it, mistress, he said, but I knew the man who carved it. He has been dead these 20 years. He walked away down the corridor, and his limping footfalls grew smaller, and Solène stood alone at her threshold, with her broom forgotten in her hand. 20 years. She was 22. She did not sleep that night, and she did not sleep the next, and on the 3rd night after the old cleaner had spoken his 20 years, the door of her chamber opened without a knock. Valus, the high warden of the right, stepped inside and closed the door behind him with both hands. He was a large man, and he moved like a large man who had been a warrior longer than he had been a scholar. But the thing Solène saw first, the thing that made her rise from her chair before he could speak, was that he had not slept either. There were hollows beneath his eyes that candlelight could not soften, and the silver in his beard seemed more numerous than she remembered from the night of the rite. Mistress Solène, he said, forgive the hour. We must speak plainly, and we have not long. Sit, my lord. There is no time to sit. He crossed to the shuttered window and with one practiced motion latched the iron bar down across the shutters. He crossed to the door and slid the inner bolt, which Solène had not known the door possessed. Then he turned to her, and for the first time she understood that he was afraid. The stag charm, he said. May I see it? She brought it from the drawer of the small bedside table. She had tucked it there beside her own childhood charm, the one she had worn all her life. She held them out to him together, side by side, upon the palm of her hand. In the candlelight they looked identical. The same shape of horn, the same small, careful notch at the curve of the neck, the same faint scoring of the grain along the flank, a scoring that had been done not with a blade, but with the point of a needle. Valus looked at them for a long time. Where did your own come from, child? My mother gave it to me, when I was 4 years old, perhaps 5. She told me that my father had carved it before I was born. She told me that my father was dead. And your mother's name? Yelena of the Weavers' District. She was the daughter of a shepherd. She had no house. Velis closed his eyes. She had a house, he said quietly. She did not tell you, because she could not tell you, and live. Solenne's hand closed around the two small charms. My lord? There is a conversation we must have, you and I, and it cannot be had in this chamber. The king does not yet know who you are. He does not yet know what you are. If he knew, tonight, he would not sleep. And if he did not sleep, there are those who would use his sleeplessness to strike. I do not understand. What am I? Velis opened his eyes. You are the reason the 7 brides fled, mistress. Selene stared at him. The bond in the hollow of your throat, he said. You have felt it. Yes. He has felt it longer than you have. He has felt it since the night he was 14 years old, on the black stone of the upper yard, when something passed through him that the healers could not name. The scars on his face and his hands are not the wounds of a battle, child. They are the mark of a bond being forged across a distance, in a soul that was not yet old enough to carry it. He has worn the veil since that night because the scars frighten lesser wolves, and because the council decided that the scars would frighten lesser brides, and because, for 22 years, no one could explain why a boy who had been touched by no other creature bore the shape of a claiming upon his skin. Selena's knees gave. She sat down upon the edge of the bed. The brides fled, Velis said, because they saw his face, and they felt what they had no name for, and they understood, in the way that instinct understands, that he had already been bound to someone, somewhere. They would not have him. They could not have him. The mark upon him was not theirs, and it would never be theirs. And they ran from it, each of them, because a wolf does not stay at an altar that has already been promised. And I did not run. And you did not run. Because the mark upon him is yours, Mistress Selene. It has always been yours. And the man who carved the stag charm that arrived upon your pillow knew, before you were born, that one day you would stand in the Hall of Ashes and the running would stop. Selene lifted the 2 small wooden stags in her trembling hand. Who carved them? She whispered. Your father, child. My father is dead. Your father was declared dead 2 winters after his capture, by the hand that took him. A body was found. A grave was dug. The lower city was told a lie that has stood for 20 years, and it has stood because the woman who told it had the power to silence any tongue that questioned it. He was not murdered, child. He has been kept alive, in a cleaner's coat, within the walls of this keep, for every day of your life. From somewhere beyond the bolted door, from the corridor of the forbidden wing, there came the small, bright sound of a pane of glass breaking. Velis's hand went to the short blade at his hip. They are here, he said. The corridor outside the chamber was dark. Velis unbolted the door in a single swift motion and stepped through with his blade low, and the flat turned outward in the defensive line Selene had seen drawn once by a city guard. She followed. She did not know why she followed. Every sensible part of her was telling her to remain within the chamber and bar the door behind him. Every sensible part of her had been wrong once already tonight, and she did not trust it. The gallery wing ran the length of the eastern wall. Tall windows overlooked the courtyard of the inner keep. 3 panes had been broken inward in a neat triangular shape, exactly the shape of a man's shoulder, and the stones beneath the broken pane glittered with scattered glass and a single dark drop of blood where someone had cut himself on the entry. 3 shapes moved in the far end of the gallery. They did not move like wolves. They moved like men trained to move quietly. Black cloaks, black gloves, short blades of a blued metal that did not catch the candlelight. Selene understood, without needing to be told, that these were not nobles in borrowed leather. These were paid killers, and they had been paid well. Behind me, Velis said. She stepped behind him. The first attacker came in a silent rush. Valus met him with a short upward strike that turned the blued blade aside, and a shoulder that drove the man hard into the stone of the gallery wall. The second came at the same instant from the other side. Valus took a cut across the back of his forearm that Selene saw open red through the sleeve of his coat, and then he had that attacker's wrist in his free hand and was bending it back in a direction it was not meant to go. The third attacker did not come for Valus. He came for her. She had time to see his eyes. They were not cruel. They were only empty. The eyes of a man who had been paid to erase a name from a list and was doing so with the same lack of feeling he would have brought to the cleaning of a stable. He raised his blade. Selene took one step back, and she felt the heat at the hollow of her throat flare so hard that she gasped aloud. It was not pain. It was as if something very old and very strong had woken inside her at the precise moment her life was about to end, and had opened its eyes, and had decided, quietly and without consulting her, that it was not ready for her to be finished yet. The light broke out of her. It came first from her open hands, and then from the bare skin of her throat, and then, in a way that she could not afterwards describe, from the pale space between her parted lips. It was silver. It was the silver of a full moon upon new snow, and it carried the cold with it. The third attacker's blade was a hand's breadth from her shoulder when the light touched him, and he did not scream, because he had no time to scream. He staggered as if struck in the chest with a great stone. His blade fell from his hand. He went down to one knee, and then onto both knees, and then he fell forward onto the flagstones and did not rise. The first attacker, pinned against the wall by Valus, saw. "Which?" he rasped. "No," Selene heard herself answer. Her voice was doubled, as if a second voice were speaking through the first, a voice older than hers by a great measure of years. "Bound." She lifted her hand. The silver light went from her palm the way a word goes from a mouth. The man pinned against the wall went slack. He was not dead, but he was no longer a threat, and Valus, with the swift certainty of a warden who had spent his life sorting the living from the finished, released him and let him fall. The second attacker did not wait to test her. He was already running for the broken window, one hand clutching his wrist to his ribs. He went over the sill in a single panicked tumble, and Selene heard him strike the gravel of the courtyard below with a cry that was more fear than injury. In the sudden ringing silence of the gallery, Valus turned to her. He was breathing hard. His forearm was bleeding in a steady, slow run down into his glove. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has heard of only in the oldest songs, something he has never quite believed was a real thing in the real world. "Mistress," he said. "What you are, the council is not ready to know." Selene looked down at her hands. The silver light was gone. The heat at the hollow of her throat was gone. She felt suddenly as though she had not eaten in 3 days and had not slept in 7, and she would have slid to the flagstones if Valus had not caught her by the elbow. And then, from the stairwell at the far end of the gallery, there came the sound of a door being opened not cautiously, as the assassins had opened the courtyard window, but with the full weight of a man who no longer cared who hurt him, booted feet upon stone, many of them. And at the head of them, drawing a longer stride with every step, came a tall figure in a black cloak with no veil upon his face and no crown upon his head, and the scars of 22 years writ plain across his cheek and his brow, and Selene, in the last of her strength, lifted her head and met his eyes. Carrion crossed the length of the gallery in a silence that carried more weight than any words. He did not stop to look at the dead man upon the flagstones. He did not pause at the pinned, slack-eyed killer still breathing against the wall. He did not even look at Valus, though Valus was bleeding and Valus was his warden, and any other king would have spoken to him first. He came to Selene. He did not touch her. He did not close the last pace between them. He stopped at the reach of an arm, and he looked at her with the whole of his bare face. And Selene saw that face clearly for the second time in her life, and understood now, truly understood, what Valus had said in her chamber about the scars. They were not ugly. They had only been called ugly by those who did not know what they meant. They ran from the corner of his left eye down across his cheek and along the line of his jaw. And they ran in spirals and arcs that almost formed a shape. And the shape, Selene saw with a slow inward turn of her stomach, was the shape of an open hand. A hand that was not his. A hand whose smallest finger was the length of her own smallest finger, and whose thumb curved at the angle her own thumb curved, and whose palm, pressed forever into the skin of a boy who had been 14 years old upon a cold black stone, had been her palm. Her hand, her unborn hand, reaching through a bond that had not yet been named, across a distance of 22 years. Selene's knees gave. Carrion caught her before she struck the stone. He caught her carefully, as if she were something that might break in a way he could not mend, and Selene, whose face was now against the rough wool of his black cloak, whose cheek lay against the scarred line of his collarbone, heard him speak for the first time since the night of the rite. "It was you," he said. His voice was not steady. "It was always you." And at the far end of the gallery, from the open door through which he had come, a second set of footsteps approached. Unhurried, measured, the tread of a woman who had been walking these corridors longer than the king himself, and who had for 22 years known a truth that no one else in the Hall of Ashes had been permitted to know. Lady Morwenna of Vey reached the top of the gallery stair. She was a woman past 60, by some counts nearer to 70, with hair the color of pewter bound in the high northern style, and pale eyes that Selene recognized at once. They were the eyes she had never quite seen, the eyes she had felt watching her through the carved screen above the corridor on the first night, the eyes that had been waiting longer than the candles and the bolts and the broken rite. "Nephew," she said, and her voice was as gentle as her eyes were not. "What, in the name of all the old gods, has happened in my gallery tonight?" Carrion did not release Selene, but Selene felt his body change. There was a tightening across his shoulders, the stillness of a man who does not wish to speak before he has thought. "My lady aunt," he said, "there were 3 men within this wing who did not belong to it. The warden bleeds. The mistress is half fainted. The council must be convened." "The council will be convened." Morwenna's hands folded before her in a gesture of perfect patience. "But not, my dear, by you. Not tonight. You will come with me to your chambers, and you will be attended by the house physician, and you will permit an old woman who loves you to sit with you until dawn. You do not know how to rest when you are distressed. My lady, the mistress, will be escorted to her chamber by the warden. She is safer under his blade tonight than under yours, which is shaking. Look down, child. Your hand is shaking." Carrion looked down. His hand, where it supported Selene's shoulder, was trembling. She felt it even through the wool. And she understood, with the new sensitivity that had awakened in her throat, that the trembling was not fear, nor fatigue, nor rage. It was the bond, arrived at its own threshold, straining toward a completion that 22 years of silence had made unbearable. Morwenna saw it too. Something passed behind the aunt's pale eyes that Selene felt across the length of the gallery. A calculation. A weighing. "Come, nephew," Morwenna said softly. Carrion hesitated. Then, slowly, with a care that was almost an apology, he set Selene upright upon her own feet. He did not look at her as he released her. He turned to his aunt and offered his arm in the manner of a king who had been commanded since boyhood to obey this particular woman, and Selene watched him walk the length of the gallery with Morwenna upon his arm, and she knew, with a knowledge that came from the silver light still humming in her bones, that she had just watched her mate walk away from her for the second time in her life. She did not sleep. Valus had bound his own arm with a strip of linen torn from the hem of his coat, and had seen her back to her chamber, and had bolted the door from the outside because, he said, the wing was no longer safe, and he would stand the watch himself. She sat in the chair by the shuttered window with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not sleep. Hours passed in which she did not weep. The mountain wind died. The candles burned their lowest. In the far distance, in the lower city of Ashenreach, a single bell rang the 3rd hour past midnight, and then rang no more. And then there was a soft sound at the paneled wall behind her bed. Not a knock. Not a scrape. A quiet, almost musical click, as of a small iron catch being lifted by a hand that had lifted it many times before. A section of paneling opened inward. Carrion stepped through it. He was in a simple black tunic. He had no cloak. His feet were bare upon the cold stone. He closed the panel behind him with the same quiet care, and he stood in the center of her chamber, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because everything that might be said was too heavy to lift. Selene rose from the chair. "You should not be here." "No. If she finds you, she will not find me. The passage is mine. She believes she has forgotten that it exists, and I have let her believe it. She is your aunt. She is the woman who raised me after my father and my mother died. She is also the woman who, if I told her what I came here to tell you, would have you dead before morning. I am still learning how to hold both of those things in the same hand." Selene crossed the flagstones to him. She did not quite touch him. She lifted her hand, and she laid her palm against the scarred line of his cheek, against the curling mark that her own hand had made when it did not yet exist, and she felt him shut his eyes beneath her touch, the way a man shuts his eyes beneath cool water on the first warm day of spring. "I spent my childhood," he said, very low, "trying to understand what had happened to me. The healers said it was a bond. No wolf in the northern houses had been bound across a distance in 7 generations, and none of them had ever been bound to a soul who had not yet been born. The council forbade me to speak of it. The council said that if the lesser houses learned that their king had been marked by an absence, they would rise against him. And so I learned not to speak of it. I learned to wear the veil. I learned to stand before women who could not bear to stand before me, because I already belonged to someone, and the mark upon me would not let them near. All of that I could have endured. But I did not know if you were real. I did not know if the soul at the other end of the bond existed in the world at all. For 22 years, I did not know. There were nights when I hoped you did not. There were nights when I prayed you did." Selene's hand slid from his cheek to the scarred knuckles of his own hand. She laced her fingers through his and held them there. "I am real. I know. I was always real. I was in a weaver's cottage in the lower city. I was 3 streets from the outer wall of your keep. You were above me in your tower, and I was below you in my mother's bed, and no one in the world thought to tell us. No one was permitted to tell us. Then the first thing we shall do, when this ends, is punish the silence." Carrion's mouth moved in a shape that, upon another man's face, would have been the beginning of a smile. He did not complete it, but Selene saw it start, and she saw what his face had been meant to look like before the veil and the 22 years, and she understood that she was looking at a man who had not smiled in a very long time. "I love you," he said. He said it the way a man confesses a thing that has already sentenced him. "I have loved you since I was 14 years old. I have loved you through 7 brides. I have loved you through the silver veil and the hall of ashes and the council. I did not know your name. I did not know your face. I loved you anyway." Selene's eyes filled. "I love you," she answered. "I have loved you since the moment I saw your face in the hall of ashes. And I think I loved you before that. I think I loved you all the years I did not know your name, and I only did not understand that I was loving you because I did not yet have the word." He lowered his forehead to hers. They stood that way, forehead to forehead, for a measure of breaths that neither of them counted. And then, from beyond the chamber door, there came a soft and urgent knocking. Velus, who had sworn he would not disturb her. Velus, whose breathing she had heard at his post for 6 hours. Valus, who would not have knocked at this hour unless something had gone wrong that could not wait for dawn. "My king," his voice came, very low. "My lady, you must come. Both of you. There is news from the lower city. They are burning the Weavers' district." The lower city burned against the mountain dark. From the high gallery of the royal keep, the Weavers' district was a crescent of red light at the base of the black slope. And above that red crescent the smoke rose in a single heavy column that the night wind could not quite bear away. Solène stood at the window with her hands upon the stone sill, and she could not speak, because the lane that was burning most fiercely was the lane in which her mother had died, and the cottage at the heart of that lane was the cottage in which she had been born. Valus was already in his riding coat. Carrion had thrown a heavy gray cloak across his shoulders and was fastening the clasp with hands that still shook, though less now than they had shaken in the gallery. He did not look at the fire. He looked at Solène. "You will remain in the keep." "No." "Solène, I will not remain in the keep while my neighbors burn in their beds. I was the girl who fetched water for Mother Ilsbeth when her hip was bad. I was the girl who took bread to old Doran when his grandson went to the wars. I will not hide behind stone walls while they burn. If you intend to bind me here, you will bind me, and you will know, for the rest of your life, that you bound me." Carrion closed his eyes. "Then come," he said. They went down through the lower gate upon horseback, a company of 20 wolves riding hard behind them, and Solène rode before Carrion upon his own tall gray, because he had not been willing to put her upon a separate animal. The bond at the hollow of her throat burned with a steady low heat, as if some part of him had stepped into her flesh to keep watch with her. The Weavers' district was chaos. 3 lanes and 6 were alight. The well at the center of the quarter was a black ring of soot where the bucket rope had burned through. A chain of weavers and tanners and apprentices had formed between the river and the nearest row of burning cottages, passing buckets with a desperate rhythm that was not enough, and which they knew was not enough. Children stood at the edges of the crowd holding the hems of their mothers' skirts. A woman in a flour-dusted apron was screaming a name that no one answered. Solène slid from the saddle before Carrion could lift her down. "Water," she called, "from the southern cistern. It is higher than the river and the pipe runs downhill. Open the southern sluice. Break the seal if you must. The water will run itself." A young tanner who had been passing her bucket since she was 12 years old looked up from the chain with soot streaked across his face. "Mistress Solène." "Go." He went, with 3 other men at his heels. Carrion had dismounted behind her. The wolves of his guard spread through the burning quarter in a smooth, practiced silence, 1 to each lane, 1 to the well, 1 to the north, and 1 to the south, a pattern that had been rehearsed in peacetime against a night that no one had ever wanted to come. And then, from the smoke at the far end of the burning lane, a horseman emerged. He was large. He was older than Carrion by perhaps 15 years. His breastplate bore the copper roundel of House Orlain, and the blade at his hip was already drawn and was already wet. "My king," Lord Orlain called across the smoke. "Will you not come and see what a father does when his daughter is made a jest of the realm? Will you not come and see what becomes of a crown that cannot keep its own right?" Carrion's hand moved to the hilt of his sword. "My Lord Orlain, you have burned your own tenants. Half of these cottages are rented from your northern holdings. I have burned nothing. I have come down to defend the people of this quarter from the traitors who sought to burn them, and I am pleased to see that the king has at last come down from his tower to assist me." Lord Orlain's smile did not reach his eyes. Behind him, Solène saw the shapes of perhaps 40 armed men, riding in a slow, loose line through the smoke, a line that was not the line of a rescue, but the line of an encirclement. "You will wish, my king, to return at once to your keep, where my lady your aunt is already convening the council in your absence. The lower city is not safe tonight. Let me escort your highness back to the safety of your walls." "The lower city will be safe," Carrion said very quietly. when every torch in your saddlebag has been accounted for. A long, cold moment. Lord Orlane's smile did not move. "You have grown bold, my king," he said. "I remember when you were a boy of 14, and you could not stand before a woman without shaking." Selene felt the bond at her throat flare with a heat that was not her own. Carrion had not moved. He did not need to move. The thing inside him that the silver veil had covered for 22 years was standing very near the surface of him now, and every wolf within 100 paces had felt it. "Mistress Solène," Lord Orlane called past him, not bothering to look at Carrion any longer. "Come here, child. A kind offer. You have been a servant, and you have been played at being a bride, and neither has suited you. My house will take you in. My daughter Marivelle has need of a companion in her retreat. You will be safer with me than you have been within these walls, because within these walls there are those who have not yet decided whether you should see morning." Selene walked slowly to stand at Carrion's side. "My Lord of Orlane," she said, "tell me, whose letter was in your hand when you gave the order to ride? You do not plan burnings. Your house has never planned burnings. Your daughter, my lord, was herself poisoned with something that made her fear the king more than a bride ought. And the person who brewed that poison is not here in this lane. But you are. And you are here because someone has whispered into your ear that tonight is the night upon which a long account can be settled. I would like to know whose whisper you carried." The line of armed riders behind Lord Orlane stirred. One of them, a captain at his right shoulder, half turned his head toward his lord as if he too, suddenly, would like to know the answer. Lord Orlane did not answer Selene, but his eyes moved, for a single breath, toward a high window of the royal keep above them on the black slope, a window from which a single candle burned, a window that Selene recognized at once as the window of Lady Morwenna of Vey. It was the answer. It was the whole of the answer. And at the same moment, from the far end of the burning lane, a great bell began to toll in the keep above, the bell that was rung only when the council had taken a vote that could not be undone, and Valus, who had drawn alongside Carrion upon his own tall black, lowered his voice so that only the two of them could hear him. "My king," he said, "they have voted to name your aunt regent. They have voted in your absence. They have declared that you have been corrupted by a pretender of unknown blood, and that the pretender must be delivered to them before dawn." Selene's hand found Carrion's. She squeezed it once. "Then we must be in the keep," she said, "before dawn." Dawn was an hour away when they climbed back through the hidden passage and into the gallery wing of the royal keep. The bell had tolled twice more while they rode. Carrion had not spoken during the ride. He had held Selene against him upon the gray, and he had kept one scarred hand pressed flat to the hollow of her throat beneath the collar of her cloak. And Selene had felt, through that touch, every decision he had not yet let himself make. Valus had gone ahead through the lower tunnels with 3 of his wardens. Lord Orlane, his encirclement broken and his name now openly spoken as that of a conspirator, had withdrawn to the southern gates to await the outcome. The keep itself was held, for this final hour, by Lady Morwenna of Vey. And Lady Morwenna of Vey had 31 servants kneeling upon the floor of the Hall of Ashes. Carrion stopped at the inner door of the hall and laid his forehead against the cold black wood. "She is holding them." "Yes. She will execute the first of them at dawn to force my return." "Yes. And I cannot go in with you at my side. If I go in with you at my side, she will have the pretext she needs to name the vote lawful. If I go in alone, she will have me upon my knees within the hour." Selene placed her hand upon his scarred cheek. "Then we shall go in neither of those ways." She stepped past him. She pushed open the great black door. The Hall of Ashes was lit by a single iron brazier upon the dais where the throne stood. The candles of the chandeliers had been extinguished. In the half-light, the 31 servants knelt in a long line before the dais with their wrists bound behind them. At the end of the line, nearest the throne, knelt the old cleaner. His gray head was bowed, His hands, behind him, were bound with a cord finer and tighter than the others. Someone had known. Selene saw that this particular servant needed to be held more carefully than the rest. Lady Morwenna of Vey sat upon the throne. She had not put on the iron crown. She had placed it upon a small cushion at her feet, where the candlelight of the brazier could catch upon it. It was, Selene understood at once, the most precise insult she could have offered. "Child," Morwenna said softly. Selene walked the length of the hall alone. She did not look at the servants. She did not look at the iron crown at Morwenna's feet. She walked the dark marble aisle that Lady Marivelle had walked upon the first night, and she mounted the dais steps that Lady Marivelle had paused upon, and she stopped at the foot of the throne, and she looked up at the woman upon it. "My lady aunt," she said, "I have come alone. Release them." "Bold. I wonder where you have learned boldness. Perhaps from my nephew? Perhaps from the silver thing that woke in you in the gallery? Perhaps from the man at the end of this line, who has been teaching you boldness from his knees since the night I permitted him to live?" Selene did not look at the old cleaner, but at the edge of her sight she saw his bowed head lift, the smallest fraction. "You killed my father," she said. "I did not. I decided that he should not be killed. That was my single true kindness in a long life of small cruelties. I decided that he should be permitted to live, in a cleaner's coat, in the corridors of this keep, where I could see him each day, and where he would see his daughter each day eventually, and know that I had allowed both of them to breathe only because it amused me. Your father was not hard to break, child. He carved a charm for you each year of your life. Did you know? I have them. 22 of them." Selene's hand closed slowly at her side. And the bond. The bond was my best work, child. I wove it when my nephew was 14. I wove it out of the oldest pages of the binding book, pages the council had ordered burned 300 years before I found them intact in an abbey wall. I wove it to forge a claim upon him that he could not break, so that when he came of age I could name the bearer of the other end, and that bearer would be a girl of my own choosing, and through her I would hold him as I have held him since he was 8 years old, and his mother and father lay dead in the snow. I did not foresee that the bond would reach across time and find the daughter of a man I had been amusing myself with. I did not foresee that the silver would go to a weaver's girl. That was an error. It is the only error I have made in a great many years, and I am here to correct it. By killing me, by taking you, you will sit beside me, child. You will speak the words I put into your mouth, and my nephew, who has at last found the end of his bond, will do whatever must be done to keep that end alive. I do not need to kill you. I need only to hold you." Selene felt the silver at the hollow of her throat begin to rise. "You will not hold me, my lady." "I shall. I have been holding my nephew for 22 years. You have felt his bond. You have not felt what I have laid beneath his bond. A slow substance, child, a very slow substance. It has been in the water of his keep since he was 14. It is what has kept the scars upon his face from ever fully healing. It is what has kept the bond between the two of you thin enough for me to walk across. He is dying, child. He has been dying for 22 years. And tonight, if I will it, he will die quickly. The antidote is in a vial upon my person. You will sit beside me in exchange for it. Or you will watch him fall before the dawn." Selene did not turn, but she felt, behind her, through the open door she had come through, Carrion already crossing the threshold at a pace that was not the pace of a man in full command of his own legs. She felt the bond at her throat pulse once, hard, a pulse that was not heat, but a cold warning, and she understood that Morwenna had not lied. "Carry on," Selene said, without turning. "Stop where you are." He stopped. She did not know whether he stopped because she had asked or because he could not take another step. Selene lifted her hand. "My lady aunt," she said, "you have made one error tonight." "Child? You have forgotten that the silver does not need your permission to cross the hall. The hollow of her throat opened. The silver light came out of her not from her hands, nor from her mouth, but from the mark itself, and it did not go toward Morwenna. It went backward, down the length of the dark marble aisle, and it found Carrion where he stood, and it entered him, through the scarred cheek, and through the scarred hands, and through the hollow of his own unwounded throat. He gasped. He went down upon one knee, and then, slowly, he rose. He rose taller than he had risen in 22 years. The scars upon his cheek were still there. They would always be there. But they were no longer the mark of a slow poison, and the weight that had lain upon his shoulders since he was 14 years old was gone out of him. Morwenna was upon her feet. Her hand flew to the small vial at her throat. She had not expected that the antidote could come from the other end of the bond. She had not expected that the girl she had dismissed as a weaver's daughter would know how to send it. "Guards!" Morwenna called. The guards at the side doors of the Hall of Ashes did not move. They did not move because Velus and his wardens had entered those doors behind them in the last minute and had disarmed them without sound, and because the Hall of Ashes now contained, upon its dark marble floor, no one Morwenna of Ve could still command. Selene walked up the last step of the dais. She did not strike Morwenna. She did not need to. She laid the flat of her palm against the old woman's pale brow, and the silver light went into her, the way water goes into cloth, gently and completely. Morwenna's eyes rolled upward. She sank down upon the throne she had not been permitted to keep, and she would not rise by her own will again. Selene turned to the hall. "Free them," she said. The servants were freed. The old cleaner, when his wrists had been untied, did not rise at once. He looked up at the small figure upon the dais, and his old mouth worked, and he could not speak. And Selene came down from the dais and knelt before him upon the dark marble floor and took his bound-marked wrists into her hands. "Father," she said. And that was the first time that word had been spoken, aloud, between them, in 22 years. The trial of Lady Morwenna of Ve was the quietest trial the Hall of Ashes had ever held. She could not speak in her own defense. The silver had not killed her. It had only silenced the part of her that had given the orders, and she sat upon the wooden bench of the accused in a simple gray gown with her hands folded in her lap, and she listened, without answering, to the long list of names the council read aloud. The name of Selene's father, broken in a cellar of this keep in the winter of her birth, and kept in a cleaner's coat for 22 years. The names of the 7 brides who had fled, each of whom had been given, on the morning of their rite, a cup of honey water brewed by a physician who answered only to Morwenna. The name of Lord Orlain, used and discarded and now imprisoned in his own northern tower. The name of the captain of the gate who had taken a letter from her hand 4 nights ago. The council voted at noon. Morwenna of Ve was stripped of her name and her house, and exiled to the cold islands of the farthest north, where the sun did not rise for 4 months of the year. She would be fed. She would be kept warm. She would not be killed, because Selene had asked that she not be killed, and the council, which had feared Selene a week before, found that it did not fear her now. Lord Orlain was not granted the same mercy. The completing of the bond was a small matter, in the end, and it was done privately. Selene took her mate to the upper yard of the keep, where the black stone had been broken since he was 14, and where, upon the stone itself, the mark of a hand too small for his own had been burned into the rock in the hour of his wounding. She knelt upon that stone with him in the gray light of evening. She set her mouth against the hollow of his throat, in the place where his own bond had pulsed for 22 years without answer. Her teeth found his flesh. It was not a great bite. It did not need to be. It was the closing of a circuit that had been open since she had been smaller than a grown woman's hand. The bond sealed. She saw, for the briefest measure of breath, every year of his that she had not shared. She saw him at 14, lying upon this same black stone with blood upon his cheek that would not stop. She saw him at 19, refusing his first bride with an apology he had rehearsed for a month. She saw him at 24, taking the crown. She saw him at 36, in the Hall of Ashes, waiting for an eighth bride he did not wish to receive. And he saw her. He saw her at 4, holding a small stag charm in her fist upon the straw mattress of a weaver's cottage. He saw her at 12, carrying water for a neighbor whose hip was bad. He saw her at 16, burying her mother in the pauper's ground behind the weaver's chapel. He saw her at 22, stepping out from behind a cold stone pillar and saying the word, "Wait," in a voice that was not supposed to belong to anyone of her station. When she lifted her head, they were both weeping, but they were both, for the first time, whole. A full year passed before the throne of Ashenreach knew another large ceremony, and this one was not a rite of binding. It was a naming. The cold black hall had been opened to the whole of the lower city by the order of its queen. The weavers had been brought up in carts. The tanners had been brought up upon foot. The fishermen from the river quarter had been permitted to walk the dark marble aisle in their working boots, and Velus, who stood beside the throne, had not objected to the mud upon the stone. The child was small, as all new children are small. He had his father's dark hair. He had his mother's wide gray eyes. The small circular mark at the hollow of his own small throat was not a bond. It was a birthmark, the midwife had said, common enough among the children of the old northern houses, and it would fade before his first year was out. It did not fade, but by then the midwife had concluded that it was no harm, and the queen, who was privately delighted by it, had asked that no further comment be made. Solene's father, who had put off a cleaner's coat and had put on the plain dark tunic of a grandfather, held the child upon his knee in a low chair by the brazier. He had not spoken often since Morwenna's trial. The cellars of this keep had taken a great deal from him, and he had not yet recovered all that could be recovered. But he held his grandson with a hand that did not shake, and he had already been teaching the small boy a song his own mother had taught him, a song of the shepherds of the southern pass that no living person had sung in 40 years. Carrion stood beside the throne with his arm about his queen's waist. He no longer wore the silver veil. He had ordered it melted down 3 days after the trial, and he had ordered the silver of it made into a single thin circlet for her brow, a circlet so slight it was almost a thread of moonlight, and she wore it now. The scars upon his cheek were still visible to any who looked. The lesser wolves of the kingdom had learned, in the year since his healing, not to look away from them. They had learned because their queen had not looked away from them, and what the queen did not flinch at, the kingdom did not flinch at either. She turned to him under the great iron chandeliers. "I have been thinking," she said, "a dangerous thing, for a queen." "Hush! I have been thinking, my lord, about the right." "Must we?" "We must, because I believe, when he comes of age, our son ought not to choose his mate by it." "No? No. I believe he ought to choose her by walking down into the lower city on a winter morning, without a crown and without a cloak, and letting her find him." Carrion drew a small, slow breath. He laid his scarred palm against the hollow of her throat, where the mark that he had made had long since settled into a bright silver thread of its own, and he looked at her for a long moment with the kind of quietness a man uses when he has no argument to make and no argument to offer, only a gratitude he does not yet have the words for. "As my queen wills," he said. And in the great hall of a kingdom that had been cracked down its center for 22 years, the assembled wolves of the north, in their working boots and their plain winter cloaks, lifted up their voices and sang a small, untidy song that no one had taught them, and that all of them had somehow learned. And the child upon his grandfather's knee, who had not yet learned any word of any language, opened his small, wide eyes and listened, and smiled.